Welcome to the Career Success Secret Show. I am your host, Mike Tomasello. I want to give a quick shout out to our listeners all around the world, all across the United States. One of the new countries that we have listeners from, starting from the previous episode, is the country of Jordan. So, welcome, Middle East, to the Career Success Secrets Party. We have what I consider a pretty important episode. Today's episode is focused on recruiters. There's actually a lot of different types of recruiters out there, and a lot of them operate in different ways. And even if you know some types of recruiters, the way they handle things will differ from company to company, industry to industry. So you want to be careful about thinking that, hey, I talked to one recruiter or I talked to 5 recruiters and now I get recruiters. You want to look at this episode from a very open-minded lens, because even someone who's had a successful recruiting career, if they've mostly done it at just 1 or 2 companies, they might be missing out on how things are going on the other side of the table. So first things first, I almost never hear people talk about the different types of recruiters. And so that's where we're going to start today. To simplify things, I'm going to break things into 2 main components of recruiters, and then we're going to talk about some subcomponents of recruiters so that you can sort of understand the lay of the land. So essentially, on its most basic level, there are 2 types of recruiters. There are internal recruiters and there are external recruiters. So internal recruiters are the ones that most people are most familiar with. They're what we would call a corporate recruiter, or they work for the employer themselves, oftentimes as a full-time employee, but sometimes depending on how the company's doing, whether they have some short-term staffing needs, they might hire some contract people. But the main thing you need to know about internal recruiters is they work for one employer. The other type of recruiter, external recruiters, is a little bit more complicated, but external recruiters, because they are a third party, they operate in a different way. Because they don't work full time for the employer, for that one corporation or that one nonprofit or that one organization, they're potentially working with a bunch of different organizations that all potentially follow different processes. For today's episode, we're going to be talking primarily about external and third-party recruiters. However, some of this insight, some of the stuff you're going to learn today will apply to internal recruiters. So if it's ever unclear, think about it and think, hey, could this potentially apply to both internal and external? And if you're still unsure, I would assume that I'm probably referring to external or third-party recruiters. And if you're ever unsure, you can either comment on the show and I will do my best to get back to you. And if I get enough specific questions around recruiters and how they operate and how to handle different situations, then maybe I do an episode of the show where we break down different scenarios and recommendations based on different scenarios and stuff like that. We'll see where we go. I have taken feedback over the past couple of weeks in terms of things that you wanted to know more about. And so thank you to those of you that have been providing feedback on what's resonating with you and what your outstanding questions are. I am listening. Now, something I want to point out that many people don't realize is that recruiters tend to specialize in a certain type of field. So I know recruiters that specialize in the legal field, and that's all they do. Attorneys and roles specifically for law firms. I know recruiters that specialize entirely in short-term temp work, contract work for accounting folks. I know people that specialize in technical recruiting, which a lot of times can be specializing in software development recruiting. Until you actually speak with that recruiter or look at their LinkedIn profile to see what types of roles that they're looking for, sometimes you can get an idea from their website what type of role they specialize in. You won't 100% be sure. Now, occasionally a external recruiter or a third-party recruiter will sort of have an outlier that isn't necessarily in their specialty or whatnot, but those situations tend to be kind of rare. Some recruiters specialize in just people at the extreme executive level. We're talking senior vice presidents for Fortune 1000 companies. We're talking CXOs of medium to large companies. So recruiters and startups, and they may or may not specialize in marketing recruiting or sales recruiting or human resources recruiting, administration, operations. It's going to differ from person to person. And so if you are going to reach out to a recruiter or build a relationship with a recruiter or take advice from a recruiter, make sure that you're talking to someone that is most knowledgeable about your field or most knowledgeable about your industry, preferably both if possible. And if they have some expertise in your particular geographical area as well, that can help. Some recruiters are very good at recruiting all over the place and have nationwide clients, or in some cases, even international clients, but they tend to specialize in a certain field if they're doing something like that. Diving back into a couple more things that a lot of people don't talk about when it comes to recruiters. So there are a lot of different types of external recruiters. There's a lot of different names for external recruiters. But I'll try to simplify them and sort of put them in three different buckets. And sometimes there can be a little overlap in between buckets, but I think you'll get the gist of it. One, there are recruiters that are a retained search. So they have been paid a retainer by a company to actively look for a role for them. Maybe it's a role that they don't want other people in the company to know that they're recruiting for. They tend to be really high level roles. And the nice thing about retained searches are you're usually not competing against other candidates via another recruiter, because this is being paid a retainer fee. The bad news is retained search recruiters are almost exclusively at the high executive level. And even if you are at a high executive level, that doesn't mean that your recruiter is necessarily a retained search recruiter. It's much more common for external recruiters these days to be what's called a contingency recruiter. And contingency recruiters, they don't get paid until someone gets hired. I'm going to say that again because it's super, super important to get. They don't get paid until someone gets hired. So another thing that's often going on with contingency recruiters is sometimes they don't have an exclusive contract to be the only firm, the only recruiter recruiting for that. So that might mean that your recruiter has other candidates that are competing against you for the same role that they don't even know about, because the employer has secretly, or not necessarily secretly to the recruiter, but the employer has opened things up so that multiple recruiting firms are sending them candidates. That's something really important to keep in mind. As you reflect on some of the different myths and misconceptions and truths and best practices that I'm going to share with you today, I invite you to think a lot of them from the lens of a contingency recruiter. And you don't need to remember the word contingency recruiter, but I want you to remember that they don't get paid until you get hired. So the moment it looks like you're not going to be the candidate, or the moment doubt creeps up that maybe you're going to take the job, but take the job temporarily and not stick around, that is not a good situation for an external recruiter, because they don't get all of their compensation if you don't get hired. They don't get all of their compensation if you don't stick around. A lot of contracts with recruiters are based on you sticking around for at least a year. The other type of recruiter I want to talk to you about is really, really important. Some of you are using them a lot. Some of you are using them too much. And they're what I would call contract recruiters or temp recruiters. Now, again, there's sometimes overlap between different types of recruiters. And so there are some recruiters that do permanent placements as well as contract, as well as temp. However, chances are if a recruiting firm is contacting you about a contract role, or a recruiting firm is contract contacting you about a temp role, that's usually what that recruiter specializes in. It's very rare that they do a high level of both. Some larger names of some more well-known temp or contract recruiting firms in the United States are Manpower, Kelly Services, Robert Half. Robert Half is actually sort of a mixed bag. Robert Half has multiple divisions that actually specialize in short term temp contract recruiting, but they also have divisions that specialize in recruiting as well. So you need to look at the fine print and, more importantly, the job description to see what they're likely going to be servicing. When it comes to contract or temp recruiting, there's a couple things that I really want you to get about it. And I'm not here to judge, because each of you listening has a different situation that might require different recruiters. Each of you has different situations where something might be great for your life, but for someone else in the same role, it's a horrible thing for their life. So, again, I'm not biased in either direction. However, I'm going to explain things at a lens based on most job searchers that I speak with. So, most job searchers that I speak with, not all, most, prefer full-time roles. So, and when I say full-time role, I mean a full-time employee W2 role in the United States, and not something that's contract, not something that's short-term. And short-term can be a 1 year contract or a 9 year contract, or temp. So one of the ways, if you're speaking with a recruiter, that you can sort of know that you're likely dealing with this type of recruiter is if they quote your say in hourly rates 95% of the time, if not 99% of the time, they are going to be a contract or a temp recruiter. So they kind of specialize in that types of things. Now, I'm hemming and hawing over how to say this in a way that won't offend anybody, won't offend some of my friends that work in contract or temp recruiting, but is also in a way where you're going to be more well informed in terms of what a good fit is for you. So the most important takeaway is the reason why these recruiters are classified as temp or contract is because that's what they specialize in. So if you are being contacted for a temporary role or a contract role, it can be tempting to say, hey, I'll just use them to get my foot in the door, and then I'll switch over into a full-time role later. But when it comes to the US government and taxes um, and how companies want to classify their employees so that they don't have to lay as many people off officially, who they give benefits to, who they give severance to. A lot of different factors go into whether or not someone is contract, temp versus full time. And so if they are looking to hire you contract or temp, in most cases, there are some very rare exceptions, but in most cases, they have no intention of that ever becoming a full time role. Now, there is something called temp to perm or contract to perm. So, perm being permanent and a eventual full time employee. But in reality, even when recruiters are telling you that, usually that's occurring less than 5% of the time. There's usually a reason why they don't want to commit to that position, especially if there's a lot of those types of positions, or it's seasonal, or there's high turnover in it. It's usually easier for the organization to classify things as a temp or a contract worker in those sort of cases. Again, there's exceptions to a lot of things, but that tends to be the case. So from a contract or temp recruiter's perspective is, well, this is temporary anyway. The role might have only last for a week, the role might only last for a month. Their selling point to the employers is they're going to find someone that's capable in a very short period of time. And capable doesn't mean the best qualified and good enough to stick around for the long term and become a permanent employee. It's just good enough to get work done in the short term in a lot of cases. Now, the thing about all recruiters, and this, I'm going to tie this back to contract and temp recruiters specifically, is the goal of all recruiters is to meet the hiring needs and objectives of the employers themselves. They are, and this is a common myth or misconception that, or maybe people know it's true, but they don't understand it. Even if you have a friendly recruiter that says they want to help you out and says they want to do right by you, the recruiter is still, at the end of the day, being paid by the employer, whether it's internal or external. At the end of the day, they're still being paid by the employer. I like to think, and I do believe, that most people are good people. And I like to believe, particularly with internal and external recruiters, that they want to see you successful and they want to see you in a role that you're hopefully going to be in for a really long time. I also believe that's the case for external recruiters, particularly recruiters where they're permanent roles, because if you're not happy, then you're not going to stick around for at least a year for them to get their full compensation. A lot of recruiters do want you to be happy and successful in the role. The thing with contract and temp is not a lot of job searchers want something that's temporary. Not a lot of job searchers want something just for a week or two, or a month or two, or 2 to 3 months, and then having to look for something all over again, or definitely having to look for something 9 months from now or 12 months from now. And so, because not a lot of job seekers want that, contract temp recruiters tend to be the loudest in the marketplace. They tend to be the recruiters that are most likely to contact you, especially if you're at an individual contributor level, especially if you work blue collar jobs, especially if you don't have any or a lot of experience in the field, you're going to be more likely to be contacted. In some cases, you might be really, really good at your job and have some great experience, and you're still getting contacted by contractor temp recruiters anyway. And my message to you is they're going to do whatever they have to do to fill those roles. And in some cases, they will say, well, hey, maybe if you do an amazing job, they'll extend it to perm. But they won't necessarily say it with the big emphasis on the maybe like I did. They'll say, oh, well, we've had people at this company, or we've had people go from contract to perm. We can't guarantee it's going to happen, but we've definitely had it. This could be a great opportunity for you. And in the back of their minds, they really know that less than 5% of the time, out of 100 people they place, less than 5 people, if that, are being converted to permanent. So that's something that I want you to be aware of. Also, the other thing about contract or temp is once you work contract or temp, it's really hard to break out of the cycle and end up doing full-time work. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying that gaps can't be overcome. But the point I'm trying to make is when people are evaluating your resume, they have to analyze how long you've been at places and say, hey, is there a potential problem here? Are they potentially not going to work out? Are they potentially not going to be a high performer? Are they potentially not going to stick around and going to want to do something else? By all means, if you need to make money and the contract or the temporal or whatever is a good fit for you, or it's going to build your experience, or it's going to give you money that you really, really need right now, by all means, go ahead and pursue those opportunities. I am not saying that you should never ever do those. However, just because those are the only types of roles you're being contacted about doesn't mean that those are the only roles that exist. The reason why contract and temp recruiters are so proactive, and you tend to hear about them more, is not a lot of people want them, and so they have to work that much harder to recruit people. Think of entry level roles for like an Amazon or a Facebook or a Disney or whatever that big well-known company is located near you. Those companies are already getting tons of applicants just from people that are like, hey, that's a great company to work for. I'm going to keep an eye out for them on the job boards, or I'm going to check their career board on a regular basis. And so they don't have to they don't have to have their recruiters be proactive as often as contractor temp recruiters. So even with um, even with external recruiters where they fall under permanent roles and they're searching for permanent roles, they're being paid an extra fee to get the benefit of that recruiter, even though they have an HR staff of their own, usually at least a recruiter, if not an entire team of recruiters on their own. And so if they're paying that external recruiter on top of the staff that they already have, it's usually because they're looking for someone that's really specialized and fit that they couldn't find on their own, that they couldn't find on your own. So if you don't have a really unique background, or you haven't worked for really large, well-known companies, particularly lately, if you don't have a lot of accomplishments and numbers on your resume or your CV and your LinkedIn, that's a huge reason why you're not necessarily going to be contacted for opportunities from some of these other types of recruiters, because they're getting people just like you applying on their website or applying to these jobs. And so they don't have to be proactive unless you're providing something that's really hard to find. So that gave you a pretty good idea of the different types. And let's start to transition into some myths and misconceptions about recruiters. So, myth number one about recruiters, and I actually mentioned this myth earlier, but it's such an important one. I didn't want it to get lost in the shuffle, and so I'm going to cover it in slightly more detail. Myth number one is that recruiters work for you as a job seeker. So oftentimes, even with really experienced people, I will, they're MBAs, and they've led, or even those that have led teams or executives, and they're like, well, I'll just contact one or two recruiters and then they'll do all the work for me. And that's not a good way to look at it, because recruiters don't work for you, they work for the employer. Their priority is filling the specific open roles that they have, not finding you a job. Now, if you're lucky enough to build a friendship with a recruiter, or you're lucky enough to get introduced by a close friend of yours or colleague of yours that knows the recruiter fairly well, then that can sort of change the dynamic from a relationship perspective, where because of the relationship, they are willing to put in a little bit more effort to give you the right advice or to help you a little bit more or whatever. But many recruiters, even if they're good, caring people, many don't have the time to help every single job seeker, or even 1 in 5 job seekers that reaches out to them, unless they have a specific role or roles that they're already hiring for that might potentially be a good fit for you. I don't want you to think that these people that you've had good interactions with, that had maybe one opening that they were considering you for, or potentially might have openings for you in the past, I don't want you to think that they're out there shopping you around. Because I guarantee you, if you were to talk to 100 recruiters like I have, I've talked to thousands at this point in my career, but if you were to talk to 100 recruiters like I have, at least 99 of them will say they've never shopped around a candidate and tried to get business that way. They go seek out the employer that has the need, quantify what need they have, and then they go out and find the best possible fit for that opening or for those openings. And so I don't want you to have a false sense of security that someone is out there doing all the work for you, because at the end of the day, no one cares more about your career than you do. Ironically, corporate recruiters or internal recruiters, even though they only work for one employer, because they are there for the company for the long term, they're looking for the long term success of the talent they bring in for the long term. So some internal recruiters will consider you for other opportunities if you don't work out for the one that you've applied for. Ironically, even though there's one employer available, if the employer is large enough, a Fortune 1000 or a Global 2000 type of company, and internal recruiters, if you build a great relationship and really wow them, but you're just not chosen to move on, then that can lead to other potential matches, depending on how you build that relationship and how well you do in the interview process and stuff like that. Some other things that I'm going to say about recruiters, and so a lot of this applies to both internal and external recruiters, but I am primarily talking about external and third party recruiters. So, a couple of things. Not all recruiters are good, not all recruiters are bad. If you've had negative impressions by some recruiters, just know that most recruiters are trying to do the best that they can. And it's usually not personal about you. It's usually about the guidance they're getting from the employer or the hiring manager or their clients, and keep that in mind. And not all recruiters are good either. So if you've been lucky enough to have mostly positive experiences with recruiters, keep in mind that there are some, a lot of which that sometimes fall in the temp or the contract roles, in that they know, or not to say bad things about any one industry, but not a lot of people want to work in the insurance industry. Not a lot of people like to work for a uniform company. And so if a recruiter works for a industry that's not as sexy or not as attractive, then those recruiters are going to tend to be more aggressive, even if you don't come from that sort of background, because they need to convince people to want to be interested in the job. And so they will put on a good sales pitch, because that is what's valued in their type of recruiting, to convince you for a job, even if it's not ideal for what you really want for your career. Keep that in mind, because that will vary in terms of the advice people give you and who has your best interests and who's really just trying to meet the needs of their employer. To go along with that, some recruiters have great advice, some don't. Some have been in hiring for a really long time, but they're really just successful because they work for a great company. Or some are really successful because the company's paying well enough where it's attracting good candidates or whatever. Recruiters sometimes don't give the best advice for people that have really struggled in their career or had to take a step back or whatever, because recruiters will often give advice from, hey, what do I want to see from the best candidates, and what have I seen from the best candidates in the past? But for you that's struggling or has some hiccups in your background, or you took a couple of years off, or you don't have as much experience than other candidates, you might need to do things differently to have a higher level of success in order to compete with the people that don't have that necessarily in their background. And some recruiters are great at advising those people, and some recruiters are not. And so take all advice with a grain of salt and make sure they have logic and rationale to back up why they're giving you that advice. Recruiters don't get paid to give career advice. So some of them give good career advice. But if you talk to enough recruiters, especially ones that are high paid, especially if you talk to ones that work for really top notch companies, they will often tell you, hey man, like I would love to be able to help everyone that comes along to me. And because I work for this big company that everyone wants to work for, I get reached out to by more people than one human being can possibly respond to and possibly give advice to. If they're a third party recruiter and they're working on commissions, like a lot of them are working on, the vast majority of their compensation is coming from commissions, then if they're spending too much time with candidates they don't have fits for, they're potentially not making their quota. They're potentially not making enough money to feed their family. And so if you ask for advice or you ask for feedback, great, go for it. And don't expect it because they don't get paid for it, especially if they don't know you yet. A lot of people are trying to contact random recruiters that don't even have an opening for them and get advice or get help or whatever. And that's really one of the worst ways to go about it, is soliciting favors from people that you don't know, that are busy people to begin with. Be grateful when you do get offered advice from a recruiter. Keep in mind, not all recruiters think the same. Not all recruiters have the same advice. Not all recruiters even know what they're talking about. And again, that's a very small percentage of them. But sometimes someone will think because they've reviewed resumes and worked in recruiting for a year that they're instantly an expert on how every single person in every single type of situation really needs to handle things, especially if they've worked for one organization their entire life. A lot of organizations handle their recruiting, handle their processes differently. I do recommend that you give recruiters the benefit of the doubt. I know some of you have had some negative experiences with recruiters, and some of them are just overworked, some of them are just underpaid. Some of them have bad hiring managers that they're working for that aren't listening to their guidance or their instructions. And so there's a lot of different things that can contribute to how a recruiter is interacting with you or not interacting with you. So I invite you to give everybody a little bit of grace and not judge all recruiters based on the negative experience of one. Because if you do that, you might miss out on some really great opportunities, or you might miss out an opportunity to build a relationship with someone who accidentally reached out to you about something that wasn't a fit. But if you had handled it better, they might have built a relationship with you over time and sent you stuff that was a lot better fit for you. So don't miss out on that opportunity. So we shared some things you might not have thought about when it comes to recruiters, you might not have understood about with recruiter. What are some of the best practices? And I'm going to warn you and say, hey, this topic is a lot more complicated than most people think. And so if you don't get your questions answered here, make sure you're out there either asking me or asking someone else. I say don't ask just one person, ask many people and get an idea of what multiple people are saying so that you can really make the best judgment for yourself. But the main point I want you to take away from that is we can't possibly cover everything about how to interact with recruiters in one episode. So if you have an opportunity to comment or you have an opportunity to interact with me on social media and ask a follow-up question, please do, because I try to answer every single question that I get asked. And if I don't answer, I probably just had a busy week and missed it. If a week or two goes by and I haven't responded to your question, please do reach out again. All right, my favorite best practice is sometimes recruiters will contact you and it's pretty obvious to you that you're not interested in the role, or you're not interested in the company, or you're not interested because it's not remote, or you're not interested because it's not a certain salary or whatever. And my recommendation to you would be, unless you're swamped, unless you aren't actively looking for a job and you're swamped, I would say even if you're not actively looking, but you want to keep an eye on your career and constantly looking for ways to grow and expand in your career, then consider taking one of these conversations and scheduling a verbal conversation with a recruiter that reaches out to you. Now, there are some caveats. If they reach out to you and the role is somewhat related to what you do, but it's just not necessarily a good fit, I would say take that meeting anyway. If you work in the field of marketing and they reached out to you for a marketing role, but it's just not the right level or not the right company or not the right duties, consider taking that meeting, talking about why you're great, building a relationship, learning about what types of roles they typically recruit for, and maybe you even take a step further. And this is like really advanced level tip for getting in good with recruiters so they remember you. Offer to check your LinkedIn database, offer to check your Rolodex if you're old enough to have a Rolodex, and check and see if you know someone or have some ideas of someone who might be a better fit for that role. One, you're helping someone else out, a friend of yours or an ex-colleague of yours, even if they're not actively looking, it's probably going to make them feel good that they're being contacted for opportunities or at least thought of by you. So that's goodwill you're building for yourself there with your other connections. But also, even if that introduction or referral doesn't work out to you mentioning to the recruiter, hey, I think you should contact David Smith, who currently works at XYZ company. Or I think you should contact Jane Smith, who's really great at marketing because of XYZ, or who's really great at software development because she's built X, Y, and Z. So if you do that for a recruiter when you don't have to, they're going to be like, wow, this person's generous. This person's connected. I should stay in touch with this person. Hey, now I want to reciprocate as a recruiter. Now I want to reciprocate. And maybe I put in a little bit more extra effort in terms of keeping an eye out for you for roles that you're a better fit for. Great way to build a relationship with a recruiter. I have recruiters that I've been in touch with for over 20 years. It's always good to have a built in relationship with 2 or 3 recruiters, if not more, that you can touch base with a couple times a year, get some career advice, and really keep a pulse on the marketplace. Now, not all recruiters are thriving. Not all recruiters will look at the marketplace as optimistically as they should, but always good to have some people that can give you an outside perspective on things. Another best practice, which I highly, highly recommend you listen to this one, because a lot of you are making this mistake with recruiters, is take every recruiter conversation that you do have just as seriously as any other interview. Even if they don't call it an interview, even if they're considering you for multiple opportunities, even if they say they want to have an informal conversation, even if they say, oh, this is just a phone screen, they are evaluating you and they are judging you based on that conversation. And that can have a huge impact on, do I even want to keep in touch with this job candidate, even for future roles? Is this person wowing me enough? Recruiters do select out candidates for people that are qualified on paper, but might not have the right demeanor, might not have the right attitude, might not show up prepared. So treat every single conversation that you're having with a recruiter as if it is the most important interview, because for some of you it is. Some of you have a really hard time getting past the recruiter. All right, folks, this episode has gone on a little bit longer than I expected, so I think I'm going to wrap up with this last one. And it sounds so simple, but yet so few people do it, especially when the recruiter makes a small mistake or they contact you about a role that's not necessarily a good fit, or they say they're interested and then you don't hear from them for a while. Which reminds me, I'm going to give you 2 best practices before I wrap up instead of just one. And arguably the most important one is follow up. So follow up. Even if they say you're the top candidate, follow up. Even if they say, hey, we're considering bringing you back, follow up. Hey, even if they say it's going to be a couple weeks before we can make a decision, follow up. So if you are interested in potentially getting a job offer, even if you're unsure, follow up. Recruiters get busy. Most recruiters, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, most recruiters are not recruiting for just one position. They're recruiting for at least five. Some recruiters are working on 20 different open roles at any given time. Completely different roles, sometimes even dramatically different teams. If they're managing 5 to 10 candidates per role, not even including all of the hundreds and thousands of people that have applied, then that's hundreds and hundreds of people that they're having to coordinate communication from. They have to deal with hearing back from the hiring manager and the other people they're scheduling interviews with. Some of those people aren't getting back to them quickly enough because they're understaffed or they're working the reason why they need to hire. So things often move slowly. Mistakes happen. People get sick. People go on vacations. There's so many different reasons why sometimes things fall through the cracks, even with really great companies, even with really great managers, even with really great recruiters. If we recognize that the other person is secretly a human being and that all of the bad stuff that happens to us also happens to them, it might help us understand to not only be more patient and understanding, but to completely put our careers and our livelihoods in their hands either, and take the responsibility of following up when we don't hear back from them. So if you take nothing more away from this than that, this was time good spent. And I sort of combined my last 2 points into one. Be nice. Recruiters are humans with emotions and have bad days, and they get yelled at by candidates. They get yelled at by hiring managers, and sometimes it's not their fault whatsoever. Sometimes they're getting far too many emails and something slips through the cracks. My clients will tell you occasionally I miss an email. And if people aren't understanding that sometimes things slip through the cracks, then maybe they're not the best fit, and that might include you. So hopefully you enjoyed understanding a little bit more about the different types of recruiters, some of the best practices, some of the stuff, and there's so much more that I didn't cover. So do me a favor and subscribe to the show. Those are really important. If you're able to download the show, that helps us as well. If you are able to rate us with a 5-star review, I know that's rather ambitious of me to ask for a 5-star review, but 5-star reviews when we're a small show, when we're a small podcast, really, really helps us out a lot. And it's literally something you can do in 30 seconds or less. And then last but not least, if you want to take it a step further, please comment or review. Reviews don't necessarily have to be long, 1 or 2 positive words or 1 or 2 positive sentences about what you like about the show or the content or what you've learned goes a long way towards us helping millions and millions of people. And I don't say millions and millions of people lightly. I've been on a mission for over 10 years to help millions and millions of people find jobs that they love, doing work that they love, making money that they deserve, so that you don't have to struggle like my family struggled growing up. So admission's very, very personal to me. Every subscribe, rate, review helps with that. You can always unsubscribe or change it later if I let you down, but hopefully if I do let you down, you'll give me the feedback. I am Mike Tomasello, and I am your host of the Career Success Secrets show. Thanks so much for joining, and I will see you all next time.